it literally just auto-generated the CRUD for us from the full stack front end to back end. So I'm pretty excited to see what this looks like. You immediately have everything to do CRUD. Is pretty wild. Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to take a look at RedwoodJS. Apparently it's the JavaScript framework for startups. Not sure what that means yet. It does look like their goal is to put together React GraphQL Prisma behind the scenes for you so that you don't have to set it up for yourself. I do have a recent video, the one I did for Team C's, where I put together GraphQL, Nest.js, React, and Prisma. So you can kind of see what that setup might look like if you did put it together from scratch. So that could be a good comparison to this one. So what I want to do with this video is maybe go through the tutorial here with you and see, what are my first impressions. I have not tried this before. This is literally the first time I'm looking at it. With that said, enough talk, let's just get started. So, looks like I need Yarn. I don't actually have Yarn installed, so I'm gonna have to install that. So I'm gonna go ahead and install Yarn as it says here. And let's go to installing and starting development. It says we'll use Yarn to create a basic structure of our app. Alright, so on the terminal right here, I think I'll just go to my desktop and let's run this command: yarn create Redwood app, Redwood blog. Looks like it's gonna install some stuff. Actually, let's go ahead and open Redwood blog in Visual Studio Code, and it says I need to do yarn rwdev. Something cool is when you first open it up, it actually recommends a couple extensions for you, and you can go ahead and install those if you want. So in the terminal, I'm gonna do yarn rwdev as it told me, and that's supposed to run the application. So let's take a look. I noticed that it generated a Prisma client. Lots of stuff going on here, some nodemon. So here's the application that it sort of runs with by default. All right, let's explore the directory structure. It looks like there is a API folder, which is effectively your backend. It's got DB and a Prisma schema in here. And the Prisma schema itself has a basic user model in here. Not really much else to see. Looks like they have some predefined directives in here. That's I believe you use these within schemas. For example, here, you can do require auth. Not yet sure where that's going to be used. There's a functions directory for, looks like this is where your lambda code would go if you were trying to do some of these serverless lambda functions. There's a GraphQL folder, which is where we're supposed to be putting in our SDL. Nothing in here yet. Live contains one file. According to the documentation, it only contains one file, which is db.js, but there's a couple more things in here. So documentation is a little bit out of date, but it says that db.js looks like it just instantiates the Prisma client. So I assume this is probably what we're going to use later in these so-called services to make queries. Services contains business logic related to your data when you're querying or mutating data for GraphQL. But we'll see that in action in a little bit. All right, next there's a web directory. This looks pretty similar to your, other typical React applications. We've got some components, empty folder, layouts, empty pages. We got an error page and a 404 not found page. Let's test that real quick. If I go to /gibberish, doesn't go to 404 page. You're seeing this because you don't have any pages yet. Oh, looks like there is a way to generate a page, but I would have expected that to go to a 404 page. I'm not sure what's going on there. Not found page will be served when no other route is found. I'm guessing I have to generate a single route first before that 404 works. App.js is the bootstrapping code. Routes.js is the definitions of your code. So let's take a look at some of those real quick. So here's app.js, which is your root, I guess, and routes.js is where you define your routes. You can see the not found in here. Looks like next step in the tutorial is to create our first page. So let's try that. New terminal yarn, caps lock. New terminal yarn redwood generate page home / hit enter. Looks like that created a homepage directory and src web src pages. So we now have this new homepage.js. What else does the terminal tell us? And there's stories, which I assume is for storybook. We got a test file, and that's it. Did it update the routes though? That's what I'm wondering about. According to the documentation, it did add a route for this. So let's go back to our routes, and voila, there it is, /is homepage. So let's quickly test our, oh, now our 404 page does work. So I think if I go to /, here's our homepage. So something really interesting here is notice that we're using a homepage component, but there's no import for it. So how does it know where to pull it from? So that's kind of cool. It says here, automatic import of pages and routes file. If you look in the routes, you'll notice that we're referencing homepage. Redwood automatically imports all pages in the routes file. Since we're going to need to reference them all anyways, and it saves us a huge import declaration. Kind of nice. What this likely means though is that you probably should always utilize that CLI to generate your new pages, I assume. Otherwise, it might mess things up. I'm not sure. Alright, looks like next step in the tutorial is create actually a second route, but this time we're gonna do page about. So same thing, it created a new about page directory for us. In the doc so far, it says here that there's code splitting happening at each page. So that's pretty cool. This is something I think you can compare with Next.js, which I believe does something similar for you as well. So let's go to /about, and there's our about page. So there's some code here for the home page that they want us to use. So I'm just gonna take that and copy it in here, and that gives us a link to the about, which allows us to navigate. Simple enough. So the link here pretty similar to React Router, so I can kind of see the resemblance there. The two here, routes.about. How does routes know that I have an about page? I don't know, but that's cool. It's probably another one of those things that are sort of auto-generated for you behind the scenes. And about page, it also asked me to change the code a little bit to mostly the same thing, except we have a new link to return to home. So if you go to about, now there's a link here to return to home. Pretty basic. Again, this routes thing seems to be aware of what the existing routes are. What's weird is it hasn't explained how these are made, but I guess you just assume that based on the path and it turns into a function, that's how you do it. Maybe that's in the documentation layouts. Alright, so I'm going to try and summarize for you what this layouts tutorial page is saying. Basically, it says that, you know, you have things in between pages that are sort of always the same, right? Like a nav bar is probably always the same across the different pages that you have. You don't want to keep copy and pasting the same code from each page, right? So for example, their example about page showed us to add this link with the about in here, and then remember the home page has that same exact code. So what they're telling us is that, so what they're really telling us is this is something that should be in the layout. The layout wraps the pages so that anything that's common across the different pages that you have should be in a layout, which makes sense. That's not a completely new concept, so that's pretty intuitive, I think. It's telling me to do a Redwood generate layout. So there's lots of generators, it looks like. Let's take a look at what this does. So it looks like in layouts, web src layouts, blog layout, I got a couple new files in there. I like that it immediately has stories for storybook, but it hasn't yet told me, you know, how to run those and how to take a look at those. So it sounds like what we're gonna do in this blog layout is basically put in the code in here that we said were common between the about and the home page. And notice that it says there's a children, it's using the children prop to, I think, put in the routes. It says children is where the magic will happen. Any page content given to the layout will be rendered here. So this is kind of similar to React Router 6's outlet, I think. If you watch my last video, you know, they have sort of a similar concept where the parent routes can have a layout component and then there's an outlet in there, right? So I think this is kind of the same concept. Alright, so at this point, what the tutorial is telling me is that the routes page needs to be updated to actually enable that layout. We actually need to wrap our routes here with that. So it tells me that I need to bring in set from the router, and then I need to wrap these two routes, the home and about, between a set. And the set has a wrap prop where I provide my blog layout. Now notice that when I did the tab completion there, it automatically gave me the relative import, but the tutorial actually says that I can do src here, and that sort of is an alias automatically depending on the context. So if you're doing the front end code in the web directory, that automatically references this src, and I'm guessing if we're doing backend code, the src would reference this src and API, at least according to what this documentation is telling me. So we'll copy that just to test it out. And it says back to the browser, you should see some duplication, right? Because we haven't cleaned up our home page and our about page. So let's take a look at those components. We're gonna clean up the header here to just be the main home, and then same thing for about. I'm gonna clean up the header, and then I guess my blog layout is wrapping the children in main already, so I'll delete that too from the wrappers here. So we'll just do the fragment as the parent here, and same thing for home. All right, and we're back to what we had before. Simple enough. And within the header here, we're gonna update our h1 to be a link, so that sort of acts as our home link, and it says we can then remove the return to home from about. So far things are pretty simple. Lots of things were sort of auto-generated for us when running the CLI. Only thing is, like, immediate first impressions is the amount of files and folders that there are here. It's kind of crazy, but you know, it's not the end of the world. Let's go forward and see. Looks like next is getting dynamic. What does that mean? Looks like now we're jumping into the database side of things, the backend. Ultimately, it looks like we're trying to build a blog application, and it says that we're going to create a schema for a blog post, and that's going to have ID, title, body, and created at. So we're going to need to open that schema Prisma, right? So we got those properties, ID, title, body, and a timestamp. Let's run our migrations, yarn rw prisma migrate dev. Enter a name for the new migration. Let's do create posts as it suggests. Hit enter. Looks like it ran. So far, nothing really new about this yet, and the Prisma setup, if you watch my other videos about it, is not really that terrible. It's actually very simple. So doing this sort of Prisma setup and migrations, still the same exact thing. They haven't really changed anything here. This is exactly how you do Prisma migrations. So basically my expectation here is we've got a SQLite database that added this into our database, a post table. So at this part in the tutorial, it says that we're going to create a post editor, and it looks like there's some kind of CRUD generator that they have in here, which is telling me to go back to the terminal and run yet again another generator, g scaffold post. So I haven't looked into what these are yet, but I think I can already somewhat guess is that it literally just auto-generated the CRUD for us from the Fullstack front end to back end. So I'm pretty excited to see what this looks like. Let's point the browser to /posts and see what we have. And now we magically have this page. It says no post yet, create one. Sure, what does that do? Okay, a new beginning, somebody. Save, post created. We got a show. Okay, so that's like a view. You can see that in post /1 it goes into that, and there's delete. I assume that works. Are you sure you want it to delete? Deleted. Let's do another one. All right, save. So that's cool. Right away you've got some kind of auto CRUD screen Now that's probably not what your intended look and feel is going to be, but the fact that you immediately have everything to do CRUD is pretty wild, right? It even has some auto formatting on the front end for timestamps. It's a nice feature. The rest of this page pretty much just goes through those options that I just went through with editing and deleting, and looks like it talks about all the files that got created. All right, let's review some of these things. So it says that there is now a post SDL, which is our GraphQL schema, which has the same exact shape as what we had in the Prisma model. How did it know it was that? I don't know. I guess it kind of explores it. And it automatically has the queries for get all, get by ID, creating with input types, and some mutations for CRUD. All right, makes sense. And then there's a posts.js that got created in services, which imports the DB. Remember that is using the Prisma client behind the scenes, and it's simply calling those Prisma methods to do the CRUD, right? And I bet this post service is being used where? Where's our resolver? That's what I'm trying to understand. How is it making that call? Let's take a look at, so I had to take a break here and take a look at the documentation, and it turns out the services and the resolver is pretty much the same thing, right? So in other frameworks like Nest.js, for example, the term service is specifically has the same purpose, where they want the business logic to live in those services and they're meant to be reusable. In RedwoodJS, it seems like they have that same exact purpose, except that they're also resolvers at the same time, right? So the resolver, it says here, how does the client get access to the output of these services? By default, that's through GraphQL. GraphQL is an API accessible to clients that relies on data from somewhere before returning it. That somewhere is a function backed by what's known as a resolver, and in Redwood, those resolvers are your services. Services are just functions. That means they can be used not only as GraphQL resolvers, but they can also be used in other services, in serverless functions, or anywhere else you invoked a function on the API side. All right, so back to the code. That's just, I guess, one thing to be aware of is that the service sort of has multi-purpose. It's both a reusable set of methods that you can use all over the place, but it also acts at the same time as your resolver, which is an interesting design decision, because in a lot of other frameworks, usually those are separate. Usually there's a distinct entity that acts as your resolver, and then the services is sort of its own reusable thing. But I haven't used this enough to really know whether or not this is a good or bad thing, but there it is. All right, so let's keep going with the tutorial. There are these cell files, which if we briefly take a look at one of them, it seems like this is where a lot of the logic goes for actually making API requests. So you'll notice that that's actually where the client-side query is being defined, as well as these various components that represent the states of those API requests, like loading, empty, failure, success, right? Like on success, show the data. And I think cells is the next section. So let's take a look at that. So that's exactly what it says. When you create a cell, you export several specially named constants, like the one we see on the left here. When React renders this component, Redwood will perform the query. It'll display the loading while that's happening. And then depending on how it returns, it's going to pick one of these, right? If there's no data, it's going to show empty. If it fails, this is how you define how your error states look. And then if it succeeds, we get our post. So there's a convention to it. So that's, I guess, what's kind of nice about it, is you follow the convention and that's how you do it. All right, so let's keep going here. Let's say, looks like we're supposed to define our first cell with yarn rwg cell blog posts. Again, bunch of files created. Lots of files created. Curious what this mock file is going to be, maybe for testing. Let's open blog post cell. .js. So it looks like it scaffolds for us basically that thing we just saw, except it doesn't yet know really what the query is. So that's something that I guess we'll be defining. It says to get you off and running quickly as possible, generator assumes that you've got a root GraphQL query named the same thing as your cell and gives you the minimum query needed to get something out of the database. In this case, we have one that's called blog posts. However, that's not in our SDL. We'll actually have to rename this to just posts, which is already in our SDL if we take a look real quick. So really that's equivalent to this query right here. So it says since we renamed the query, this needs to be renamed to posts as well. And let's plug this cell into our home page and see what happens. And looks like I just blog posts cell. Go back to our home page here. The stringified result of our posts, right? So that's taking each item and stringifying it. And it says that we can alias this name if we wanted to change that prop name. So looks like we'll add title, body, and create that. And that brings in more of our data from our CRUD thingy earlier. All right, and we can make this list actually be, a prettier UI as it suggests in the tutorial. Now it's an article with a header and a body and a timestamp. Looks like that. So in summary, what did we actually do to get this far? We made a home page, we made a layout, we defined the database schema, we ran migrations, we scaffolded CRUD, we made a cell to load the data and take care of loading empty failure states, and added a cell to the page. So I think that sort of completes this cycle, and you basically, in my mind, just keep creating these cells to load the data in. This will become the standard lifecycle of new features as you build a Redwood app. So far, it basically says that you didn't have to do any plumbing. It kind of auto-generated everything for you, which is good, but then it's not great for fundamentals, I feel like. What if you actually wanted to learn how to put this stuff together? All right, so I think even if you ended the video here, I think you already have a pretty good sense of how this works, right? But let's just finish up this tutorial. Looks like we're going to create a new blog post page where you can click on a specific blog post and see the details of that specific post. So similarly, let's do another generate of a page. In this case, blog post singular. And back in our blog post cell, we're actually just going to manipulate this a little bit, and we're going to turn each header into a link to that specific blog post. So now another one is a URL here. It's a link, and if we click on that, it does /blog post, which we haven't really defined yet what's going to be on that page. So it says here that we need to modify the routes a little bit so that it actually takes into account what that ID is. We're going to a specific blog post, so we need to know what ID it is. So notice we have this new route for blog post inserted in here, and we actually need to move this inside our set here, right? So now it's in the blog layout. Remember, that sort of gives us our wrapping layout with a navigation bar. And then we're going to add, looks like here's how you do route params with the curlies, which is a slightly different syntax from other things you might have seen, like React router. And then back in our home page, and then back in our link in the blog post cell, we need to pass in stuff in here so that it knows what that parameter is. So ID, and we're going to do post that ID, right? So it sounds like what's passed in here is basically providing the parameters for these, templated paths. So let's go back to our homepage in the UI, click another one, and now that's going to blog post /2, and it's rendering our page. So that's behaving exactly how we expect it to. All right, next, it seems like, remember, the workflow is anytime you're trying to create something that needs data from the service, you need to create a new cell. So it's very heavy on the convention here, this is how you do it, right? So new cell blog post, and go into our blog post cell. So we now have these, our boilerplate as we've seen before. And it says that we need to bring this into blog post page, right? So this is the page that's being rendered over here right now, right? Like if I change this to I'm here, it's going to change that on the right page. So we're just going to change this whole thing to use blog post cell. What's really odd to me is, notice again, I've had this same problem earlier, is it's able to see the stories, but it's not able to see the cell itself, which is kind of just weird. That's not intuitive to me. I did have a slight typo here. This should be lowercase l, but that shouldn't have affected the IntelliSense. Alright, so our blog post cell needs a little bit of correction. Same thing. This actually needs to be post, and we don't really need this alias. So here's something interesting. So in here we have a parameter, an input that we need the ID, right? And where does it get that from? That means it's actually coming in from the prop like this. And where does it get the value for that? It comes from the prop of blog post page. And why is that? Because it says in the documentation here that Redwood has another trick up its sleeve. Whenever you put a route param in a route, that param is automatically made available to the page that route renders, which means we can update the blog post page to do what we have here. So that's kind of like, that's coming back to this route that we have, right? Where we have the path blog post /ID, and then we're passing in this page component. It's saying that it's automatically, feeding in whatever this dynamic value is as a parameter, and it feeds it in as a prop to blog post page, which is where we load our blog post cell, right? So this is coming directly from the route param, so it kind of wires it in automatically. And then if you read through the tutorial here, it'll say that if you test this out right now, it's actually going to go into an error because we have a type mismatch. Because coming from the route params, the ID here is actually coming in as a string, technically. And you could use parseInt, just to wrap the value here if you wanted to. But it says that the parameter can actually also have a type if you do int like this. So it automatically translates that into a number so that you don't have to parse int. So if we go to our home page and we click on the link to the blog post, that goes to blog post /2. And this is actually a blank page right now because I made a mistake where, remember earlier when we renamed the name here for the query, we also need to update the prop name in the success component. So this is now post, right? So now we're able to see the data in our blog post, right? It's getting that route param, turns it into an integer, and then passes it through the query and so on, and goes back success and loads our JSON stringified post. All right, so the finishing touches here is just creating a blog post component, which is going to have basically what we had before already. So let's do generate component blog post. And again, notice that I almost never create files from scratch. I'm always going through the generator here, which I think is the intention of Redwood, so that it enforces a specific structure to your application so that you're not deciding that yourself. It's sticking to that convention. So component blog post is going to get created in websrc/components/blog post. So let's open up blog post JS, and we're actually just going to update this to be that same article with a link to the item that we had before. And remember, we used that before in blog post cell, right? That's the same exact component that we have in here. So we're going to do blog post, and let's give this a key of the post ID, and remember to forward the post down And then we should be able to pretty much do the same exact thing in our blog post singular cell and use that in our success thing here, except we don't need a key, and make sure to import. And back in blog post cell, not sure if there's any downside to doing the relative imports here, but let's just switch that to the absolute as well. And now we were able to sort of use the same exact component in the list of posts as well as the details posts, right? So if we go back to our CRUD thingy earlier in /posts, we can add a new, let's do another one here. Right now we should have two. So if we go back to our home page, now we got those two. So you can kind of see that original CRUD UI that we have. That's really useful for just quickly standing something up so you can add some data, play around with it. It can even maybe become your admin page, right? If you are making a blog and you don't care too much about how it looks, you could just start with that. It doesn't have to be pretty if people can't see it. But I think the intention they had here is that you likely need to just get something started before, perhaps while the designer is still figuring out how the UI looks, so that you can start with that. But what we effectively built here, right, the ability to have a list and drill into the list, we really just rebuilt a version of that CRUD, right? We have a list in /posts, and we're able to drill into it and click into it to see the details. That's really the same thing. We just rebuilt it. Now, I think that is the core of, if you're trying to get an impression of RedwoodJS, right? That's sort of, I think, what we've done so far already gives you a pretty good impression. And if you already like it or dislike it, you probably know at this point. There is more stuff to the tutorial that I don't think I'm going to cover in this video. Maybe I'll do it in a follow-up. But they do have some tutorial here on doing forms. So if you were trying to do the create and the update yourself, it talks about that, I think. Oh, so I see it does say it's built on top of React Hook Form. So it's a light abstraction on that if you know how to use it, which React Hook Form is a sort of a competitor to Formic. So there you go. And then the rest of the tutorial here does go into, how do you start to do mutations, which I'm going to save you some time because I don't think you want to watch me go through the rest of these. So the backend piece of it is all what you've seen so far, right? Create a table in the Prisma, database, migrate, update the GraphQL schema, and then update your services. And then on the front end side, what I find a little bit interesting is, so similar to how you define your queries using GQL, for you to actually do the mutations, you use a use mutation hook, which is very similar to React Query, Urkel, Apollo Client. What's weird to me is that it's a little bit inconsistent, because it's like, why have that cell convention but only use it for queries? It does say in the documentation that they're actually also exposing use query from Apollo Client, which you can use, but they recommend using cells instead, which is fine. But I guess I'm not super convinced yet that this cell structure is good or not. Anyways, let's look at what else is in this tutorial, which is very long, by the way. Holy crap. They do effectively turn that posts CRUD that we had earlier into an admin page, like we said before. And it looks like they just added /admin to the routes. You don't have to watch me do that. Authentication, couple examples here with Netlify, Identity, Auth0, Superbase, which is good, I guess. I don't think I'm going to cover that. That's a little bit out of the scope of this tutorial. And then deployment, same thing. You got a couple different options here. AWS, Heroku, depending on what you're trying to do, because you also have to have your database. And then if you're using those lambda functions, you gotta probably deploy somewhere that supports lambda functions or functions in general. And that kind of wraps up the tutorial 1. Apparently there's a tutorial 2 where they actually talk about storybook and jest. I'm not going to cover that here. That's too much content in one video. Let me know in the comments if you want to see that though. So I think this is probably a good place to stop. Final impressions, overall impressions. I'm not convinced that you need it, to be honest with you, because like I said, if you already know how to put these things together, then in my mind, why wouldn't you? Because if you use Redwood, it might improve your productivity in the short term, but later on when you're trying to do things that Redwood doesn't directly support, how would you do it? You're kind of boxed in from there. Like, for example, what if you didn't want to use Prisma, right? So basically, it's not good if you don't like the decisions that they made for you. It is probably one of the most opinionated frameworks out there. I guess you could say that I like frameworks that, allows me some form of flexibility. Like Nest.js, I can very easily switch from GraphQL to REST to WebSockets to whatever, right? This just feels like it's too much. Like, I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of how it's doing the front end side of things, because there's so much you can do with front end nowadays. Like, in terms of making GraphQL queries, you can use React Query, you can use Apollo Client, you can use Urkel. In terms of just frameworks, right, you can use Nest.js. That opens up a host of other possibilities. So to me, this almost feels like a weird, unnecessary lock-in where if you want to start customizing things, you're kind of screwed. But if you are just trying to get up and running quickly and you're okay with the conventions and the opinions that it has, that's probably fine. I would compare it to like Adonis.js. Anyways, just to wrap it up, would I use RedwoodJS? I don't think so, guys. I think it's interesting, but right now I don't see a compelling reason to use it, right? Like, the cells are really the only thing that I feel like is vastly different from any other framework, but that's not really the best thing either. Like I said, not super consistent in terms of usage, and there is a lot of, I feel like, time saved for it that it does for you with auto generating all this stuff and hooking it all up. But then there's also a learning curve that you have to get through before you can be productive. So depending on how well you can pick that up is, I think, really going to determine, is it going to work for your use case. Anyways, guys, that's my first impressions of RedwoodJS. Let me know what you think in the comments. Would you use it or would you not use it? Is there something else you'd prefer? Do you think I'm wrong and maybe it is actually a framework that I should spend more time on? Let me know in the comments, or let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to cover. Anyways, I'm going to end the recording here. I hope you enjoyed the video and hope you have a good day. Thank you.